Good evening and welcome. On Friday night, thousands of Fijians tuned in and watched keenly as the Economy Minister, Honorable Ayaz Said Qayyum, delivered in Parliament the National Budget for 2020-2021 financial year. Tonight on the show, we are joined by the Honorable Minister for Economy to discuss some of the finer details of the national budget and how it's due to impact Fijians. Good evening, sir, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
So immediately after the announcement, we saw that the national budget was called a bold budget, a reformative one, and there's been commentary that you've announced some of the biggest tax reforms in modern Fijian history. In the lead up to the budget, of course, with the backdrop of a global pandemic, a global recession, and Fiji's economy due to recede as well, we'd like to start off the discussion on what some of the key priorities were for the government in the preparation of this budget.
I mean, essentially, when you prepare for a budget, you need to look at where you are at, what are the future projections. And essentially, if you look at what's happened throughout the world, it's completely unprecedented, where borders have shut down. Even when we have other, diseases or illnesses in recent history, borders have not actually closed down globally. I mean, planes don't fly. Planes stopped overnight. And also for a country that's dependent quite significantly on the tourism sector, it essentially meant that hotels just shut down overnight. So people who worked in those hotels no longer had a job or were told to go home and come back when there is work. It also had an impact, for example, on the aviation sector. It had an impact, for example, on the garment industry. And because these two industries, for example, tourism, garment, and the related industries or ancillary services that they provide, has a much wider impact. So the person who may be selling, mithai outside the Fiji Airways offices on the corner, they no longer had people walking through and buying the mithai. The guy who used to sell, boiled EV on the roadside, these people are no longer buying it there. So it has a much wider, insidious sort of spread throughout the economy. So that's where we are at. We also know that because of this pandemic, nobody really knows what will happen in terms of will the borders open next week, will the borders open in 6 months' time, will the borders open in 3 months' time, or 2 years' time? Will there be a vaccine? And when I say opening of the borders, meaning to the way it was previously. So there's a lot of uncertainty. Many countries are sort of struggling as to what to do. So we obviously had to take a very, decisive step in terms of putting our best foot forward. We can't simply just sort of, dab our toes in the water. Because for us, the key priority was to get jobs back on. Jobs are very important. Key priority is to get economic activity being revived. That's critically important, because when you revive economic activity, and we can talk about this later on, because economic activity can be revived not just only with tourism. You have, for example, if you spur on construction, people get jobs in the construction sites. Those people who work on the construction sites will have money in their pocket, they go and spend, etc. Then it has a rippling effect throughout the economy. So those are the kind of key issues that we need to look at. And also how to also place yourself for the future. You don't want to be sort of sitting around twiddling your thumbs and then wait for the borders to open, then you react. You must actually position yourself in a preeminent position, actually, because everybody else will be doing the same too. The same in the tourism sector. I mean, you can see ads now. Phuket is offering $99 for 5 nights in a 4-star hotel. So, they're obviously gearing themselves up. It's not opened up. Bali is not opened up. Fiji is in a much better position. We are now a COVID-contained country, essentially meaning there's no active cases of COVID-19 in the community. There are some people at the quarantine, Fijians who returned, and they're at the quarantine level, but they have been very tightly controlled. Nobody gets out. In some countries, people break quarantine quite easily, people run away, etc. And this is where, the very sort of disciplined approach that Fiji's taken, in particular using the RFMF, has helped. In fact, now a lot of people are saying we want to follow the model you've used. For example, using our disciplined forces, in particular RFMF, to maintain the quarantine level. You want to replicate that. So obviously it's worked really well, and we obviously want to thank RFMF, the police, etc., and indeed our medical authorities. So that's where we're at. So you have to take all of that into account and say, well, okay, what can we do now? And that's, the kind of decisions we made are based on that. At the same time, trying to obviously make sure that there's a safety net, because there are jobs that have been lost, and there are people who do need to get some access to funding. We are lucky that a lot of people are able to have access to land. They've gone back to the village, they've gone back to lands that their family own, and they're planting. A lot more people are now planting. People doing, the Fiji, Bata, all of those things are happening. People are becoming a lot more innovative, a lot more creative in their thinking. And obviously government had to do the same too. So we have to provide the safety net for people who are unemployed, because not everybody can go. People living in, say, for example, in Nasinu, they may not necessarily be able to go and access land, etc. They simply obviously cannot just live off the few feet of land behind the house. They need access to funds. So this is why we work together with FNPF, provided that, and government has allocated, for example, in this budget that was announced yesterday, $100 million to pay for unemployment benefits, and the continuation of that which we started in this budget, and the existing budget which ends on the 1st of August. So they're the things we've taken into consideration, and also how to spur economic activity locally, domestically. And if you look at economic histories of most countries, in particular in the past century or so, in the 1930s, when we had the Great Depression, as they called it, most of the countries went into what they call Keynesian style economics, which is actually government spending a lot of money to have public infrastructure being built. So Sydney Harbour Bridge was built during the Great Depression. It employed literally thousands of predominantly men. Some died there, but they built that bridge, and the other countries did the same thing too. Obviously the world has changed now, and in fact small countries like ours don't have that level of accessibility of funds or ability to get into getting funds at very low yields. So we have done a balancing act. So we provide, if you see the various tax incentives we provide to get the private sector to participate in what is traditionally what people would call public sector spend. So we've said, for example, if we get the private sector to build government offices for us, we give you investment rebate, plus on top of that, once we start renting the premises from you, you can get a tax, or you don't actually pay any taxes on it. It's tax-free on the rental income you have. So those are the kind of things we've done. So for example, to spur domestic construction work. And of course we've done that with some of the public infrastructure. You see, because we've actually we've been very lucky to get a lot of offers of funding from offshore. The World Bank, IMF, ADB, Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, which is a new bank that's lending to us for the first time, and others have offered, because of the good track record we've had for the past 10 years and the prudent management of our finances. So there's a lot of confidence. For example, World Bank has offered us $400 million. Now, we can't use the $400 million all at once. $100 million for what you call direct budget support. To give it to us, we put in the budget, we can spend as we like. The balance of the $300 million is for specific projects. Now, there's no point borrowing money if you don't have any project to spend it on. You need to have projects ready. So, if you're going to build a building, now, you of course have to get an EIA done. You have to do your architectural plans, all the design plans, etc. That can take about 9 months. No point borrowing all that money, you're not going to use it. So we have focused on what we call, ready to start construction buildings, and you'll see that announced in the budget.
We'll have more for you when we come back in our next segment. Stay with us. Getting back into the discussion, Honourable Minister, government spending, of course, as you announced, stands at $3.67 billion, revenue projected at around $1.6 billion. If we can have a little discussion on the debt to GDP ratio, which has increased quite significantly. Previously, in the previous financial years, the government, of course, maintained, and we knew that the debt to GDP ratio was at a sustainable level. The deficit, or rather the debt to GDP ratio, has been pushed to 83.4%. Now, of course, the burning question, is this cause for alarm?
Well, no. I mean, if, for example, there are two things happening. One is you have the revenue you used to have is no longer there. It's dropped here. Right? Now, so that's dropped. And then, of course, you don't have much economic activity, in terms of revenue, ability to collect in the immediate future. You don't have that. So that's happening. So you have to be able to continue with the government services. You have to actually go out and get more money. If you actually had your revenue was maintained, at sustainable levels of what you had previously, and then you went and borrowed and over on top of that and spending that money unwisely, then obviously it's not a good spend of acquiring debt. You should not do that. But because the revenue is dropped, you need to continue to provide services. And at the same time, you need to be able to spur economic activity. So, for example, we've got this Fiji Recovery Rebate Scheme that now we're offering, with Fiji Airways, offering airline tickets at discounted rates together with partner resorts. And government is saying, you bring in the first 150,000 tourists, we'll pay you $400 rebate on each tourist you bring in. Now, that's going to cost us $60 million. If we didn't do that, if we did not incentivize them, then there's no traction in that area, or very little traction, or maybe traction that'll take much longer. We want those hotels, our national carrier, to start making money. And the fact that they can offer these packages now and be able to sell them now, the tourists may actually come later. It's like buy now, come later. We will pay that once they come here. So it incentivizes them. Now what will happen when they come? What will happen when they start paying money? The people working in those hotels will get employed. They'll have their livelihoods. They'll go back to their jobs. They'll also feel, psychologically, there's a huge boost for them. So that's the kind of thinking around it. So if you're borrowing to be able to spur economic activity, there's nothing wrong with that. Yes, if you're going out and borrowing money at 10%, 20%, 15%, then obviously it's quite ridiculous from that perspective, long-term debt I'm talking about. So we have got now the World Banks and the IMFs, the IDBs lending to 2%, 2.5%. And some of them maybe even lower, because we're doing some debt restructuring with them. So the point is that there's nothing wrong with that. In the same way, a lot of people in Fiji have talked about debt. And as we've explained previously, they're saying, the future generations will have the debt. Now, if you build a 4-lane road today, outside Nadi Airport, Namaka, Martintar, etc., the future generation does not have to build it. If you build something today, it costs far less than if you build it 10, 15 years later. So in fact, we are saying that the future generations don't have to borrow that money to build the 4-lane road. We're building it for them now. You see, this is the thinking that we need to have. There's nothing dangerous about that. And if you're borrowing it smartly. So I think, if you, for example, I'm trying to think of an example to give you. If you are able to, and I've used it several times, if you borrow money to give somebody access to electricity, you are increasing their productive capacity. The children can study, etc. They have a fridge, they can store their food. If they're fishermen, fisherwoman, or fishers as they call them, if they can store their fish for the next day and sell it by the roadside, don't let it go, it doesn't rot, you're increasing the productive capacity. So it has it has a multifold effect in society, and it's good, good debt.
So if we could explore the Bula bubble and the blue lanes. Recently we had the blue lanes open up with the first yacht docking in Fiji, but there's still some concerns by some Fijians saying that, is the Bula bubble feasible? Will it work?
Well, it would work. I don't know when they say it's not feasible. Feasible from a financial perspective, feasible from a health perspective, feasible from an economic perspective. You see, a lot of people make comments. You need to take a more nuanced approach. Why did we open the Bula bubble? We opened the Bula bubble is because Fiji is now COVID contained. So we are saying to the rest of the world, look guys, it's safe to come to Fiji. We don't have any Fijian walking around in Fiji with COVID-19. Now, Australia and New Zealand are countries that we are very familiar with. We are very familiar with their health systems. And we are saying, and because they also contribute almost 70% towards our tourism arrivals, we are saying to them, you can come to Fiji for a holiday under various conditions. So for example, Australia, there's obviously been a recent outbreak just in the past few days. When Victoria's been locked down, I understand parts of Sydney, like Liverpool, Campbelltown, all those places are also in lockdown. Restaurants, everything is all shut down. That happened only in the past few days. What are we saying? For an Australian to come to Fiji, You can go into your self-quarantine in your own home. You do a COVID-19 test. You produce a certificate, it says negative. You can come to Fiji. When you come to Fiji at the airport, you'll be separated from anybody else arriving from anywhere else. You can't just simply get out of the airport and go to your resort, in a taxi. There'll be provided dedicated transportation, what we call the VIP lanes. You'll go to a dedicated resort. You go to that resort. So, for example, I don't want to make a plug for any resort, but Resort X. They'll go to Resort X. And Resort X will be the one that has put up its hand to say, we'll take these tourists. We'll be a designated tourist for the Bula Bubble. So they go to that Bula Bubble resort. The workers get employed. They all create their own bubble. The workers, etc., will be tested. They may live on site, etc. And they have their holiday there. They spend their money. Then they come out on their dedicated transport, go to the airport, catch the plane, and go back home. Right. That's the Bula Bubble in a very simple terms. The reason why we've said that is because we're obviously trying to create economic opportunities whilst managing our health risk. Now, if tomorrow New Zealand, we understand, may become COVID contained in the next few days or week or so, if we are COVID contained, they are COVID contained, there should not be any problem traveling without having those dedicated resorts. You can come and go and stay at any hotel, and you can roam around Fiji as long as before coming on you've done a COVID-19 test. In the same way, our people should be accepted. If you've done a COVID-19 test, you are COVID contained, we are COVID contained, trade, travel, people movement should commence. Our seasonal workers can go. There are some seasonal workers supposed to go, they can go. They may want more seasonal workers. That's what you call managing your health risks and also managing your economic risks. That's the Bula Bubble in a nutshell. Now, all of this, of course, depends on how the Australians will treat their citizens. At the moment, the Australians are saying, no Australian can go overseas. That's their decision. Our decision, we'll welcome you under these conditions. Spain, for example, they have one island they've allowed all German tourists to come to. And that island actually has an international airport. Germans get on specific planes, they fly to that island, they get off, that island is treated as a bubble, they holiday, they party, they spend their money, they go back out. They don't go and mix around with the rest of the Spanish population. Maldives is doing the same thing now. They just made a recent announcement. Maldives obviously is many small islands. They have a similar sort of system in place. Ours is the Bula Bubble. We've sort of maintained that because we are saying that there's some element of risk, but we'll manage that risk in that manner. UK has just recently announced in the last few days that any British citizen or anybody traveling from Fiji to UK or from UK to Fiji and then going back won't have to go under quarantine when they go back to UK. So we wish that UK at this point in time was much closer to us and we could have direct flights and they could come as tourists. But my point being, that's the sort of protocols around that. The blue lanes, obviously, which we started seeing people come through, where you're saying that when, for example, when you sail, before you sail, you need to do a COVID-19 test. And then, if it takes you 14 days, for example, to sail from USA to Fiji, that 14 days will be treated as a quarantine period as long as nobody gets on or gets off. If you've done 14 days at sea in isolation on your boat, you come to Fiji, you have the RFMF, your medical people, they check you out, you can do a COVID-19 test. If you're negative, great, you can roam around.
We'll carry on the discussions on the blue lanes and the Bula Bubble when we come back in our next segment. Stay with us. Welcome back. In the last segment, we finished off by discussing blue lanes and the Bula Bubble. So if we'll allow you to finish your point on the Bula Bubble before we move.
Sure, just very quickly. But you have people, for example, a lot of the yachts that are coming from New Zealand. Now, it can take, depending on the size of the yacht, etc., 5 to 7 days to come from, say, northern island of New Zealand to Fiji. Now, so if you've done 7 days, again, with nobody getting on, get off along the way, So you've done 7 days at sea. You have to do 14 in quarantine. So you come to Fiji, you'll be in quarantine for 7 days. The balance of the 14 days, you get tested, you're okay. So that area from Port Denrau, Wailoaloa, Bay Area will be the kind of quarantine area on the water. Now, we are expecting over 100 yachts. That's actually very good for us, because when these people get cleared and they roam around, they'll go around Fiji, they'll spend money, they'll buy goods, they'll buy alcohol, they'll buy food, they'll go to the local markets, etc. We know that they are safe, we are safe, and they spend and they encourage, and by word of mouth. And because Fiji's got a good, good brand prior to COVID-19, which we've been building upon, in particular with the advocacy, particularly through the PM, through climate change, our credentials on the environment, etc. These things actually brand you quite well if you do it strategically, which we've been doing actually for the past 7 or 8 years. There's a particular strategy has been involved, a lot of thinking behind the scenes. So people actually then trust the brand. In the same way, we have a couple of high net worth individuals that have come to Fiji, staying here for 3 months. One of them actually wants to do business here now, list on the South Pacific Stock Exchange. We have the Survivor Series people, they want to come here. They're willing to go into quarantine and then start shooting. All of these revenue streams were unanticipated. But because of the measures we took, because of the focus on health, we are able to then build our capacity. Because as you would know, apart from health risks, you also have economic risks that actually can lead to an individual not being unwell.
Mm. If we can look at some of the tax deductions that have been announced, especially those that have been redesigned to ensure the tourism industry returns to normalcy, the limit on the 6% turnover tax, the ECAL reduction, as well as the shaving off of $100 from the departure tax. So I'd like to address here one of the questions that you may have come across. Even before the budget announcement, we've heard economists and experts say that we should not perhaps try to, bet everything we have on an industry that depends on other countries reopening their travel borders. Perhaps we should look at bolstering our agriculture sector. And although we've seen that, the budget allocation for the agriculture sector in this financial year has remained steady, we had, of course, Dr. Rohit Kishore, who told us that if you want to hope to substitute the revenue of the tourism industry with agriculture, you would need a massive injection into that sector. So talk to us about this and why the focus of the government seems to have remained on the tourism sector.
Actually, that's not true. That it's only remained in the tourism sector. As announced in the budget, agriculture has got an increase of about $3 to $4 million. So it's not remained steady, it's actually increased. And there's a number of initiatives, the backyard garden. The Minister of Agriculture has been out, giving out seeds, etc. We've got various incentives. We've got some targeted large farmers in, for example, rice and various other areas. So those incentives have continued. In fact, they've been augmented. They've been enlarged, made much bigger. Now, for example, even if we said, okay, we're going to now give $70 million to agriculture, question is, what are you going to plant with $70 million immediately? I'm talking about immediate returns. Where is your market? Because obviously we still, if you go to the market now, some farmers are now complaining, or people who sell at the market, the prices have come down. There's an oversupply. So if everybody, for example, planting dalo, and it's all for local consumption, the price of dalo will come down. If you're going to, everybody going to plant long bean or bindi or bhaji, the price will come down. So you see, it's not simply as saying, well, let's put more money into agriculture. Of course we are focusing on agriculture. Of course we are focusing on things, a lot of scope. And you will see, for example, the protection rates on things like sheep, pork, beef have remained. We've not brought them down because we want to protect and in fact grow the local sector in those areas, whether it's also shrimps, for example. So see, it's not a question of just simply allocating money. It's a question of also growing it, giving it protection or not. So in many of the, for example, locally produced manufactured goods, we have brought down the rates. But in things like the agriculture sector, in particular for animal husbandry, in those areas that I mentioned, pork, beef, sheep, etc., we have protection rates are still there. So Agriculture, of course, yes, but you need to, for example, be able to value add. You need to be able to do a lot more processing, and there's a huge focus on that. If you see in the budget as announced, we're doing this agronomic building in Coronivia. Why is that done? Because they can do more tests, make your products a lot better. Those types of things are all being put in place because these are what you call structural changes. A lot of people, unfortunately, some politicians or people who may be, sitting behind the computers, etc., they simply think just by making a large sum of money available, suddenly everything will become hunky-dory. No, you need to understand how will the money be spent, where will it go? Will the countries, for example, be willing to take out agricultural produce? But in the recent times, with no planes flying with passengers, the once-a-week flights that have been taking place to LA, Sydney, Auckland by Fiji Airways, about 80 to 85% of all the freight has been agricultural freight. So people are buying Yangona, of course, still. They're still drinking grog, in USA and Sydney and, Auckland. They still want our dal or cassava or bhaji or bhindi or eggplant. And we're still supplying that. So obviously we're still looking at new markets, also processing downstream, processing when you do value adding. So that's being done too. But the reality of the matter is that we have all these hotels. You can't simply abandon these hotels. You can't say, oh, let's look for another sector. Yes, we are. In fact, there's announced in the budget. We're looking at opportunities in, for example, manufacturing assembly lines. A lot of countries now, because they had a lot of their assembly lines and manufacturing plants, for example, in China, now looking at diversifying. They're diversifying in the sense of diversifying their manufacturing locales. So they want to go to other countries to do that. So maybe there could be Australian, New Zealand companies that rather do manufacturing assembly lines in countries closer to home. And that's where we are. We have a lot of discussions as announced in the budget about Navutu. In Lautoka, we're working together with IFC and FNPF to develop the site really quickly. So we are, there is that sort of diversification. In fact, if you look at the Fijian economy, 15, 20 years ago, we were far more dependent on one or two sectors. Today, there's a bit more diversification. Of course, not as much as we want, but the fact is that there is a lot more diversification than what it was. We obviously continuously need to do that. For example, we provide a lot of incentives in the ITC sector. Fiji Airways, has built this aviation academy. We've got, other focus in other areas. For example, financial services. We are doing that. Fiji has become a hub in respect to telecommunications. And we've given various incentives for that.
Stay with us. We'll have more for you when we come back in our next segment. Welcome back. Another interesting announcement that was made during the budget announcement was a 150% tax incentive for businesses that will hire local artists. Mr. Kayum, when you announced this, you said that the arts matter. And this business incentive or this incentive that is given to businesses, what effect do you think that this will have on our local economy?
Well, let's flip it around. What impact will it have on those artists who actually do perform? It will actually incentivize hotels and various other, public places or public facilities that offer, restaurants, for example, services to members of the public to hire local artists. Some hotels nowadays are kind of moving away, for entertainment, simply play on some music, put on a jukebox or whatever it is. But we want them to hire locals. If they're going to hire, for example, a Meke group, a local singer, or a local band. So what we're saying, if you're going to say, for example, pay them $2,000 to perform, you can claim 150% tax deduction. Right? So it's incentivizing them. Say, okay, I'll hire these guys, I'll get a bit more of a tax, deduction. So that's what we've done because, obviously they matter. The reality of the matter is many, if you go down the Coral Coast and, various other places, a lot of the, for example, villages that used to perform, a lot of the local bands that used to perform, they're no longer performing. I saw a story, I think somebody used to be in a band is now gone into the meat industry. Now, that's great. He's obviously been quite versatile in respect of his skill sets, but there are a lot of people who may not be able to do that. So, we want to encourage local art, local musicians. Coupled with that, of course, we made all microphones and all the things related to the music industry, all zero-rated duty. And this brings me to the main point, is that we want these artists to know about this, and we hope to, in the next few weeks after the budget gets approved, to actually go around informing people in the same way that the members of the public, we've reduced duty on 1,600 line items. This is the list. 1,600 line items, not all of them of course have been reduced. People need to know. So for example, the duty on toothbrushes come down from 15% to 5%. On washing detergent, it used to be 32, depending on what detergent you bought, is now 5%. So the people who buy these items, they should know that this has come down. They need to demand from their shops and the shopkeepers and supermarkets to have a commensurate reduction in these things. And we've said that we're giving some additional and specific funding to FCCC, and also we'll make some legal amendments to give FCCC the power to be able to monitor this, and in fact, give them the legal teeth to be able to enforce this also. There's no point in government reducing that if it's not passed on to the consumers. And in fact, it would be quite stupid of these businesses not to pass it on, because at the moment there's not much consumption. So, we are trying to also make a cultural shift. A lot of the businesses in Fiji, not a lot I should say, to be fair, some of the businesses in Fiji have not necessarily always passed on the reduction in duty. They've kind of eaten up the duty that government has reduced or foregone the revenue, potential revenue, that's supposed to be passed on to the consumers, but in between they don't let it pass through. So this is a perfect time to do this, because businesses are also quite desperate to get people coming through, and hopefully make a cultural shift. In the same way, we talked about the tourism sector. Very few resorts in Fiji actually include what they call inclusive deals. If you go to countries like Mauritius, if you go to the hotel, the room rate includes your meals. It includes maybe 4 or 5 stubbies of beer, right? So these are the kind of things we're trying to do. So in this Fiji recovery rebate package that we're offering, we've got all inclusive deals. So hopefully that becomes the new norm, and that's critically important.
So let's look at businesses. Like you said, you've given them incentives as well. They have been announced in this budget, and one of them happens to be the business license reforms. Historically, for the first time as of this year, we will now see people who have home businesses being recognized as an official business. They will be able to also get their business licenses with less loopholes to jump through. Talk to us about that and how you think that this is going to foster and also encourage economic growth.
You no longer will require a business license. And nor will you need to pay for it, essentially. I know a lot of people are still finding it hard to digest that, because we've just been so much part and parcel of the business environment in Fiji. In fact, it started in the colonial days, So even today, as we speak, without the law being changed, and it should get changed in the next week or so, if I am ANZ and I open up a branch, I have to go and pay a business license for my branch wherever I'm going to open. Right, to somebody who's opening a small canteen, they have to go and pay for it. What we are saying now, like countries like New Zealand have done, you simply need to register your business. So if you want to open a business tomorrow, Geraldine's shop, Geraldine's dresses, you simply need to go and register at the company's office. You can go online, you have your TIN, your tax identification number, Geraldine's dresses is registered, that's it. You go and rent a shop or build a shop, start your business. Pay your tax, make your money. Simple. Now, previously, to get a business license used to take weeks. Now, as announced, in the recent times, it takes now 48 hours to get a business license. But obviously, there are certain businesses that still require some regulatory check-off. If you want to open Geraldine's restaurant, then the idea is then you need a sign-off by the health people. We don't want you to be cooking or cutting the meat on the floor. There's certain standards you need to follow because of health risks. But those ones, they are simply regulatory checks. So the idea being that the regulatory authorities are more focused on compliance as opposed to not giving you the business license in the first place. And you have to adhere to those standards. So it makes it very easy. Firstly, you don't actually have to pay for any business license. Secondly, it's not the waiting time has been reduced. And thirdly, there's another piece of document you don't need to fill out. But what we are encouraging everybody is that to start any business, you must register it with the company's office. Doesn't necessarily have to be a limited liability company. It can be just a trading name, but get it registered. Because you see, in this way, when everybody is registered, whether they're in Lau, whether they're in Suva, whether they're in Lambasa, or whether in the Western Division, when we have everybody registered, in times like this, or if we need to make some targeted assistance, we know exactly how many people are in what industry, what business, how big or small is the business, and we can directly assist them.
We'll come back with our final segment after a short break. Stay with us. In our final segment, let's talk about the announcement that came as a surprise to some about Fiji's decision to close down 5 embassies around the world. And you're also re-looking at some of your other embassies that are around the world. Could you explain to us the rationale behind that?
A lot of people, well, the fact is that Fiji is the only independent Pacific Island country in the Pacific with so many embassies throughout the world. Now, apart from, of course, Australia and New Zealand. So that's where we're starting off from. Secondly, we've done an assessment, many of these embassies don't actually give us a good rate of return on the investments we make. Investments, we're not talking about the amount of money we actually spend to maintain those embassies. That's number 2. And then secondly, thirdly, many of these embassies were opened, using, sort of kind of geopolitical considerations. Geopolitical considerations, in fact, those considerations that existed 10, 15, 20 years ago have all changed. Even 5 years ago, it's changed. The world has changed quite dramatically. And for small island developing states like Fiji, what should be a primary focus? Is it all the embassies should be based on geopolitical considerations, or should be based on things like trade, investment, the branding of Fiji? But that's the ball game that we should be in, as opposed to, trying to have some impact on some, geopolitical machinations that are played out by large countries, which, we are a very small player. And many countries are doing this. In fact, in this period, if you go around the world, a lot of countries have, in fact, started doing this prior to COVID-19. And so we've taken this opportunity. And I think it should really come as no surprise. In fact, a lot of people have sent congratulatory messages to us because they see it as a good use of resources. So, case in point, we have, New York, the embassy in New York, 1 hour away by plane or 3 hours by train is Washington. A lot more activity happening in New York. New York is expensive to run. Costs us over $3 million a year to run New York. The rent is high, etc. It's an expensive city. But New York is very important because the UN is there. We have our troops, etc. We have a military advisor that's based in the New York office. So it's important. Not much activity in respect to Washington, but if there is any bilateral activity, then of course New York can look after it. There are many countries that don't have 2 embassies. They don't have one in New York and one in Washington. They use the New York one to service Washington. So it makes sense. In the same way, if you look at Malaysia, Jakarta, it's very close by. Now there's there's always this political sort of issues too. Like for example, if your High Commission, from what we understand, if it's based in Malaysia, it cannot be accredited to Singapore. Indonesia can be. Now Indonesia, prior to COVID, is going to be the 6th or 7th largest economy in the world in a few years' time. Much larger country, more opportunities, but Jakarta is only 45 minutes, depending on what 1 hour away or so from Singapore. Just across the border, it's only a few minutes away from Singapore, Indonesia as a country. It can look after the rest of Southeast Asia. Japan, obviously, Japan is a country that's got a very good track record, good credibility internationally speaking. They do a lot of work in Fiji. They can also service the northern part of Asia. EU, the Cotonou Agreement is there no more. As you know, we had the ACP, EU arrangements, post-independence in the 70s, 80s. That's, of course, given away to now EPA and all those types of arrangements now. We've got an embassy in Geneva. Now, Geneva, of course, has a multi-pronged approach because many UN agencies, including organizations like IMO, etc., that are all based in Geneva. They're already doing some work. It's an expensive embassy to run. But if you don't have Geneva, it can service Geneva. It can service the rest of the other European countries. And you're actually defraying the cost of the Geneva expenses. In the same way, New York, you're defraying the cost because the other functions will be able to provide. So similarly, Seoul has the same issue too. Again, a very expensive city, but Japan is only, hour and a half away or 2 hours away. So it won't necessarily have an impact. And many of our partners in these countries, those countries actually understand. And they recognize what is happening globally and also economically. The point being is also, we, as announced in the budget, we're also looking at how these embassies are run. If you look at a lot of the Scandinavian countries where they operate, when they open the embassies, they have probably the top 1 or 2 is from their country. The rest of the people are locally engaged staff. They still provide the same service. In fact, in some countries, much better service, because locally engaged staff know the lie of the land. They know which doors to open, how to open the doors. Plus, it's cheaper. Because when you send somebody from Fiji, you have to pay for everything. Apart from the salaries, you pay the allowances. If they are children, you pay for the school fees, etc. And some of the schools are very expensive. But you need to have a strengthened office here in the capital to provide the right amount of service, the right amount of feedback to them, the right amount of capacity for the output. So again, we need to look at these overseas missions in terms of the return on what they're giving us. Because, at the end of the day, it's taxpayers' money.
So something interesting that you mentioned on during Friday's address was something about the airbag trailer assistance. Now, for those who are not familiar about what it's all about, please talk to us about that.
Well, we've had a huge problem in Fiji where the roads have been breaking up, in some of them quite significantly, because there has been previously no control on the amount of load a truck, for example, carries. So when you have a truck with a short axle base, or only one axle, carrying a lot of load, it actually makes dents in the roads. When it turns corners, you see some of the roads on the edges, it's like this. Turns corners, the way it shifts, and then goes onto the road. So it breaks up the road. We've been investing, literally now billions of dollars since FRA, even before that, in roads. So do you want to keep on throwing money and the road keep on breaking up and people start complaining about it, but it's just wastage of good money? So then we introduced the loads, the restriction on loads. And it's very good news because out of the 9,000 odd trucking companies, there's only about 1,000 that's been recalcitrant, only about 1,000 that's actually not necessarily following or have overdue fines, etc. So, and a lot of you see some of the trucks now, you see they've got trailers. You have the cabin with the chassis, and then you have the trailers. So what we're saying, this is the best way. You go overseas, Australia, New Zealand, everywhere, these trucks actually have a trailer where you put the load. Now you can see some trucks with 2 trailers. Now, what we are saying, in order to encourage those businesses that have those trucking companies, if you bring in trailers with what we call airbags, when you have trailers with airbags, it actually helps cushion the weight from being planted directly onto the road. I'm putting very simple terms. It does not get transferred directly onto the road. So just to encourage them, and because we want to have a huge focus on this area, when you go to some of the 4-lane road outside Nandi Airport, at that intersection, it's all twisted and curled up and what have you. Because of that, 2 a.m. in the morning, people are driving these trucks. So there have been very heavy penalties imposed, and now actually a lot of people are complying. So, we want to further assist them to say, look, if you bring in the airbag trailers, we'll actually give you direct cash contribution, $20,000 for each trailer. And, trailers, depending on where you get them from, can cost from $100,000 to $120,000. We'll contribute $20,000 towards it, and hopefully you get a lot more traction. There are, of course, other more sort of sophisticated. If you see sometimes trucks with the load, when they turn the corner, it makes this sound because the back trailer cannot turn. It doesn't have the ability to turn. So now one of the companies is actually bringing that. That's the next phase. But these people are already bringing that in. So in fact, the back wheel of the trailer also turns. See some of the trucks, they sort of move to the side.
Yeah.
That also buggers up the road. So, that we're trying to move along, but we're incentivizing people.
With that, unfortunately, so we've reached the end of our show. Thank you so much for joining us. And of course, we'd encourage each and every one of you to access the government website so that you can read it yourself and find out the finer details for yourself. And of course, you can watch FBC News for more stories on the national budget announcement. And that's all we have for you on the show tonight. Thank you for joining us. Have a good evening.